Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My topic this evening is socialism, armed robbery, and murder based on delusion and profound ignorance. I'll attempt to prove three propositions concerning socialism. One, socialism, understood as government ownership of the means of production, requires armed robbery and murder in order to be established. Two, the desire for socialism is based on a delusion, the belief that profits are stolen from wages. Three, socialists are ignorant of the role of capital and confuse it with consumers' goods. What socialism means. Socialism is government ownership of the means of production, not a welfare state. Thus, for example, the various Nordic countries, such as Sweden and Denmark, should not be regarded as socialist countries. The overwhelming bulk of industry and property in those countries is privately owned, and production is carried on at the initiative of private businesses seeking to make profits and avoid losses. Indeed, taxes on business profits there have been lower than here. True examples of socialism. True examples of socialism are Soviet Russia, China under Mao, and Nazi Germany. Nazi Germany had a system of de facto socialism, in that the government exercised all the substantive powers of ownership. The Nazi government controlled all prices and wages and decided what was to be produced, where, in what quantities, by what methods, and who was to receive the products. Why establishing socialism requires outright robbery. Socialism is government ownership of the means of production throughout the economic system, not just in a few isolated industries here and there. If the government nationalizes just a few isolated industries, it can pay meaningful compensation to their owners by raising taxes somewhat on the rest of the industries. But if it nationalizes the whole system, it has no way to provide such compensation, for there are no industries outside the economic system. The only possible source of funds in this case would be wages, with the result that then the former capitalists truly would be functionless parasites, which is how the socialists already depict them. The capitalists would not be paid not only because of these facts, but also because they are regarded as thieves in the first place, allegedly having amassed their wealth by stealing it from the wage earners. Thus, the socialists believe that stealing the capitalist's wealth is a matter merely of, quote, expropriating the expropriators, unquote. Why establishing socialism requires armed robbery and murder. The situation of the socialists is essentially the same as that of a mugger. If a mugger seriously wants to rob someone, it's not enough for him merely to request his victim's wallet. A serious robber must come armed and threaten his victim's life. Facing the complete loss of their wealth, the capitalists will rightfully resist, and to seize their wealth, the socialists will have to kill them. Large-scale resistance implies civil war, as in Soviet Russia and China under Mao, when previous generations of socialists carried out armed robbery on a national scale. Most social democrats are not socialists and should stop calling themselves socialists. The so-called social democrats describe themselves as socialists, but to their credit, most of them, at least up to now, haven't had the stomach for the mass armed robbery and murder that establishing socialism entails. This is why, when they've gained power, they haven't established socialism. They've stopped with the establishment of a very expensive welfare state whose cost is borne overwhelmingly by the wage earners. Such social democrats should stop calling themselves socialists because they are unwilling to do what the establishment of socialism requires, namely commit armed robbery and murder. It takes the communists to establish socialism. They are the true socialists in that they're willing to commit the armed robbery and murder that's required to establish socialism. The desire for socialism rests on the delusion that profits are stolen from wages. True socialists are not only potential armed robbers and murderers, their willingness, their readiness to commit armed robbery and murder rests on a delusion, namely the delusion that profits are stolen from wages. All socialists believe that originally, in what Marx called simple circulation and Adam Smith called the original state of things, when there were as yet no capitalists, manual workers nevertheless somehow managed to produce and sell commodities, and that the money they received in exchange for their commodities was wages. Only later, when capitalists appeared, they believe, did the phenomenon of profit emerge, and did so as a deduction from what had originally, naturally and rightfully been wages. Profits, not wages, are the original and primary form of labor income. The truth is that workers producing and selling commodities do not receive wages. The money they receive in exchange for their commodities is sales revenues. For example, the money received in exchange for a loaf of bread or a pair of shoes or whatever is not a wage, it's a sales revenue. The absence of capitalists means that while there are sales revenues, there are no costs of production to deduct from those sales revenues, because in the absence of capitalists, there is no buying for the sake of subsequently selling, and thus no outlays that show up as costs. Hence, the entirety of the sales revenues of these workers is profit. Thus, profit, not wages, is the original and primary form of labor income. This conclusion is reinforced by recognizing that the workers in Adam Smith's original state of things and Marx's simple circulation are actually self-employed businessmen rather than wage earners. These businessmen have sales revenues, but no costs and no capital. The rate of profit they earn is therefore infinite, a positive amount of profit equal to sales revenues divided by zero of capital. Capitalists create wages and reduce the proportion of sales revenue that is profit. Capitalists do not steal their profits from wages. To the contrary, they create wages and expenditure for capital goods, which show up as costs of production that must be deducted from sales revenues. Capitalists thus reduce the proportion of sales revenues that is profit, along with creating and then increasing the proportion of sales revenues that equals wages. At the same time, their expenditures for labor and capital goods result in the presence and growth of capital assets on their balance sheets. Thus, diminished profit margins must be divided by a positive and growing capital sum, which explains how the general rate of profit has fallen from infinity at the beginning to the few percent it represents today. Profits are still the primary labor income. I have shown how profits are the original labor income. Profits are still the primary labor income. They are attributable to the labor of businessmen/capitalists, those workers who provide guiding, directing intelligence at the highest level in their firms. They are the income of men such as Ford, Rockefeller, Bezos, and their less-known counterparts throughout the economic system. As we credit Columbus and not his crews with the discovery of America, Napoleon and not his soldiers with his victories, the president and not the State Department employees with America's foreign policy, it is they whom we should primarily credit with the products of their firms. The wage earners they employ are the help in producing the businessmen's capitalist products. Because the wealth of the capitalists is in the means of production, it serves everyone. The physical beneficiaries of the means of production are everyone who buys their ultimate products. For example, the physical beneficiaries of iron mines, steel mills, and auto plants, and of oil fields, pipelines, and refineries are everyone who owns a car and buys gasoline. Such facts show that in order to benefit from property, you don't need to own it. You merely need to be able to buy its products. Thus, we all benefit from the capitalist wealth in the form of means of production. The wealth of the capitalists is the foundation of the supply of products and the demand for labor. Thus, between capitalists and wage earners, there is in fact a harmony of interests, not a basis for class warfare. The greater is the wealth, the capital of the capitalists, the greater are the means of production. That's what their wealth overwhelmingly consists of. The greater are the means of production, the larger is the supply of products and the demand for labor, and thus the lower our prices and the higher our wages. The effect of the capitalist's accumulation of capital is progressively rising real wages that enable workers to avoid having to send their children to work and to afford to take jobs offering shorter hours and improved working conditions of the kind that don't pay for themselves. Capital accumulation, not government intervention, is the cause of a rising standard of living. Businessmen and capitalists, not politicians and union leaders, are responsible for the rise in the standard of living. Socialists think of the wealth of the capitalists as though it were a heap of consumers' goods. Socialists think of capitalists as big, fat men with their plates piled high with food, while next to them sit starving workers, lucky to have 3 beans on their plate, which the capitalists would allegedly also eat if it didn't make their workers starve to death and thus reduce profits in the future. Socialists think of factories and all other means of production as though they were mountains of spaghetti, and that the billionaires who own them and who in fact use them to produce products for all and to pay wages to scores of millions just have too much, and so must share it with the less fortunate. The capital wealth of the country is what socialists today believe is available to them to double the minimum wage, establish paid family leave, and provide free medical care and college tuition. The truth is that poverty is caused not by the capitalists having too much capital, but too little capital. Seizing and consuming their capital perpetuates and worsens poverty. To achieve prosperity, we need to stop stealing the capitalist wealth and stop burying them under hundreds of thousands of pages of government regulations. Then they will accumulate more capital, production will increase, and real wages and the standard of living will rise, as they did throughout most of our history. To have an economy such as we do, in which practically all are able to own air conditioners, automobiles, flush toilets, refrigerators, telephones, television sets, and all the other goods that constitute the American standard of living, we need an economy in which small numbers, even single individuals, are free to own the factories in which these goods are produced. Summary. Socialism requires armed robbery and murder on a mass scale if it is to be established. It rests on the delusion that workers earning sales revenues without any cost to deduct, and thus 100% profit on those sales, somehow earn wages. And then when capitalists appear and create wages and costs and reduce profits relative to sales, their profits are alleged to be stolen from wages. Socialism is blind to the fact that the primary producers in the economy are not wage earners, but businessmen, capitalists, who provide guiding, directing intelligence at the highest level in their firms. The wealth of the capitalist serves all. It is the foundation of the supply of products and the demand for labor. It increases real wages, shortens hours, improves working conditions, and eliminates child labor. Capital accumulation, not government intervention, is the cause of rising living standards. Socialists are profoundly ignorant of wealth in the form of capital and confuse it with a heap of consumers' goods available to them to redistribute without harm, when in fact doing so undermines the ability to produce and thus real wages. The socialists belittle true economics as trickle down. Their theory is loot and plunder. Their promises are fairy tales read to children by the wolf. And like wolves, they want not merely to bite the hand that feeds them, but to eat that hand and the whole rest of the body of those who feed them. They are moral cannibals. To learn more, read my essay. My essay, Marxism, Socialism, a sociopathic philosophy conceived in gross error and ignorance, culminating in economic chaos, enslavement, terror, and mass murder, a contribution to its death. For complete knowledge of what's wrong with socialism and right with capitalism, read my magnum opus, Capitalism, a treatise on economics. You'll then understand in full how socialism is a movement of crazed, delusional dummies. A person has to be crazed to be ready to commit armed robbery and murder, delusional to believe what socialists believe about profits and wages, and an incredible dummy to be as ignorant as they are about capital. You'll also learn how capitalism is a system of a harmony of self-interest between people of all economic classes, races, and nationalities, how it results in continuous economic progress and rising living standards, and how it has made it possible for the average wage earner in every industrial country to live at a level far surpassing that of kings and emperors in past ages. A final word. Both of the books I've described are available on Amazon.com in both Kindle and print formats. To find them, search under my name in Books or Kindle. A copy of each has been donated to the Sage Library, along with a copy of my 10-CD lecture program on the economic theory and political philosophy of capitalism. I hope you'll take the opportunity these works provide to increase your knowledge of capitalism and socialism. Literally, nothing less than life and liberty depend on understanding the evil of socialism and the good of capitalism. Thank you.